The ceasefire is dead. Not weakened, not strained, not on shaky ground, dead. In the last 24 hours, the United States has launched a second straight night of strikes against Iran, hitting dozens of military targets across the country. And Iran has responded by firing back at 3 separate American allied nations in a single night: Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman, while claiming to have destroyed critical radar systems and struck installations tied directly to the American military. Sirens are screaming across Bahrain right now. Kuwait's military says it is actively engaging hostile aerial targets in its own airspace. Jordan just intercepted 4 Iranian missiles fired directly at its territory. And in the middle of all of this chaos, the single most important oil choke point on the entire planet, the Strait of Hormuz, is once again effectively closed, and the market has already started to panic. Brent crude just jumped 3.6% in a matter of hours, climbing to $78.70 a barrel, up from a recent low of around $70. If you think this is just another Middle East flare-up that will fade from headlines in a week, you have not been paying attention to what this exact choke point has done to global oil prices before. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the entire world economy just flinched the moment this ceasefire fell apart. Let's rewind for a second and understand exactly what collapsed here, because this was not some vague, informal understanding between 2 hostile countries. This was a real, negotiated agreement with a real timeline attached to it. Back in April, after more than 5 weeks of direct fighting between the United States, Israel, and Iran, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. That ceasefire held long enough for mediators to hammer out something more formal, a memorandum of understanding announced in mid-June, specifically designed to bring this entire conflict to a full and final end within 60 days of being signed. The presidents of both the United States and Iran signed that memorandum on June 17th. 60 days. That was the promise. That was the window the entire world was told to watch, a defined, measurable path toward peace in one of the most dangerous, most economically important regions on Earth. We are now barely past the halfway mark of that 60-day window. And instead of moving toward peace, we are watching the exact opposite unfold in real time. An escalating exchange of direct military strikes that has already spread across 4 separate countries in the Gulf. Here's how fast this fell apart. On July 6th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps struck 3 commercial vessels near Oman, including a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker, accusing the ships of trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz without Iranian permission. The very next day, the United States responded with strikes on Iranian military targets. Iran fired back with missile and drone attacks on military bases across the Gulf, where American forces are stationed. By Wednesday, Trump stood in front of reporters and said the memorandum of understanding was finished, over, done, while still claiming he remained open to further negotiation. By Saturday, Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed once again. And now, just days later, we are watching a full second wave of American strikes hitting dozens of targets inside Iran, followed immediately by Iranian retaliation against 3 of America's regional partners simultaneously. This is not a slow deterioration. This is a controlled demolition of a peace agreement that took months to negotiate, and it collapsed in less than a week. Let's talk about exactly what happened overnight, because the scale of this retaliation should genuinely alarm anyone watching global markets right now. According to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, its forces struck long-range aerial radar and vessel detection radar systems inside Oman, claiming to have destroyed them entirely. In Bahrain, the IRGC launched missile and drone attacks specifically targeting installations and infrastructure tied to the American military stationed there, a country that also happens to host the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, the exact naval force responsible for patrolling the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. Bahrain's own Ministry of Interior had to issue a public warning, telling citizens to remain calm and head to the nearest safe location as air raid sirens sounded across the country. In Kuwait, the military confirmed it was responding to hostile missile and drone threats in real time, warning the public that explosions might be heard as air defense systems attempted to intercept incoming attacks. And in Jordan, military forces successfully intercepted 4 separate missiles launched by Iran before they could reach their targets. 4 different countries, all responding to direct attacks or the threat of direct attacks within a matter of hours. Meanwhile, the United States has not been holding back either. According to U.S. Central Command, American forces struck what officials described as military air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and dozens of small boats belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, one-way attack drones, and for the first time in this entire conflict, one-way attack sea drones. An escalation in the type of weaponry being deployed that signals just how seriously Washington is treating this latest phase of the confrontation. Just days before this newest round of strikes, the U.S. had already hit more than 80 separate targets inside Iran in a single operation, and simultaneously reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil sales, specifically in retaliation for the earlier attacks on commercial shipping near the Strait. Now let's talk about why this specific choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, terrifies energy markets more than almost any other stretch of water on the planet. Roughly 20% of the entire world's energy exports passed through this narrow waterway before this conflict erupted. Oil and gas flowing from some of the largest producing nations on Earth, funneled through a corridor so narrow that even a handful of disrupted or destroyed vessels can send shockwaves through global pricing within hours. And right now, that exact scenario is playing out. Shipping data from the tracking firm Kepler shows that vessel traffic through the Strait has fallen to its lowest level in 5 weeks, with only 6 ships making the crossing on a single recent day. A dramatic collapse in normal maritime activity for one of the busiest shipping corridors in the entire world. Iran claims the waterway is effectively closed and has repeatedly warned vessels against attempting to transit through it, while American officials insist it remains open and say they are actively escorting commercial traffic through despite the danger. Both of those claims cannot be fully true at the same time, and the fact that global shipping companies are voting with their actual behavior, avoiding the Strait in dramatically reduced numbers, tells you which version of reality the market actually believes right now. Here's what makes this even more dangerous than a simple disagreement over control of a waterway. According to analysts tracking this conflict closely, Iran has essentially conceded that it cannot match the United States and Israel militarily, and so it has deliberately shifted its entire strategy, transforming what began as a military confrontation into an economic one instead. Iran cannot outgun American forces in direct combat, but it absolutely can inflict enormous economic pain on the entire world by threatening, disrupting, or outright closing the single most important oil transit corridor on the planet. And according to experts studying this exact dynamic, Iran has, in some very real ways, already succeeded in doing exactly that. This is not a fight over territory anymore. This is a fight over leverage. And Iran has found the one lever capable of making the entire global economy feel the consequences of a regional conflict most people outside the Middle East barely pay attention to on a normal day. Let's put some real numbers behind exactly how devastating this leverage can be, because this is not the first time this exact scenario has played out during this same conflict. When the original war between the United States, Israel, and Iran first erupted at the end of February, the disruption to oil flows out of the Persian Gulf triggered immediate fuel shortages and rationing in parts of Asia that depend heavily on oil supplied through this exact strait. And prices on the global oil market surged dramatically, climbing from roughly $70 a barrel just before the war began to an average of $103 a barrel by March. That surge, while devastating for most of the global economy, actually created a massive financial windfall for 2 specific countries. Iran itself, which saw its oil revenue jump by nearly $25 million per day during that period, and Russia, which saw an even larger increase, roughly $150 million in additional daily oil revenue during the exact same window. Read that number again. While the rest of the world absorbed painful price spikes at the pump, Russia was quietly pocketing an extra $150 million a day, which connects directly back to everything we've discussed in previous videos about the Kremlin's desperate need for outside revenue streams to keep funding its war in Ukraine. Every time tensions flare in the Gulf and oil prices spike, Russia benefits. And that is not a coincidence. That is one of the ugliest, least discussed side effects of this entire Iran conflict. And the economic damage from this war has never been limited to oil prices alone either. When this conflict first erupted, flights in and out of the entire Middle East came to a near complete stop, stranding residents, expatriates, and tourists across the region. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest airports on the entire planet, was directly damaged by drone strikes during just the second day of the war, forcing it to halt all flights entirely before reopening days later at only limited capacity. Shipping companies began rerouting away from both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea entirely, adding enormous cost and delay to global trade routes that businesses and consumers everywhere through higher prices on everyday goods. Just 3 days ago, China moved to block exports of helium, a critical material needed for chip making, directly citing the strain this war has placed on global supply chains. Think about how far the ripple effects of this conflict have spread, from tanker traffic in a Middle Eastern strait all the way to a helium shortage threatening the global semiconductor industry, an industry that touches nearly every piece of modern technology you use every single day. Now let's talk about the political pressure driving decisions on the American side of this conflict, because President Trump has been explicit about his motivation here in a way that adds real urgency to how this plays out over the coming weeks. Trump has been pushing hard to bring down oil and gas prices specifically ahead of this year's midterm elections, a political reality that puts enormous pressure on his administration to find some way to stabilize this situation quickly rather than letting it drag on indefinitely. At the same time, Iran stands to lose billions of dollars if this conflict continues spiraling without any resolution. Its own oil exports and broader economy dependent on some level of stability returning to the region. Both sides have massive financial incentives to find a way back toward de-escalation. And yet, despite those shared incentives, we are watching the exact opposite happen in real time. Strikes, counterstrikes, and a widening web of countries getting pulled into direct confrontation. There is a diplomatic thread still technically alive here, too, and it's worth understanding exactly what's on the table because it explains part of why this specific disagreement has proven so difficult to resolve. Iran's own interpretation of a key clause in the original Memorandum of Understanding gives it authority to manage traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. And Tehran has used that interpretation to insist that vessels must transit through the specific shipping lane closest to its own coastline, a route that preserves Iranian control and leverage over who passes through and under what conditions. The United States and its allies reject that interpretation entirely, and Oman, acting as the primary mediator in this entire process, has reportedly drafted a tentative proposal to manage traffic through two separately controlled routes instead, an attempt at a compromise that would give both sides some measure of the control they're each demanding. Iran's own foreign minister traveled to Muscat specifically to discuss this proposal with his Omani counterpart, and for a brief moment, it looked like there might be a genuine path toward diffusing this exact standoff. Then, just hours later, Iran's Revolutionary Guard fired what it called a warning shot at a vessel attempting to cross the strait via an unauthorized route, and declared the entire waterway closed all over again. That is how fragile this entire diplomatic process has become, a promising conversation in Muscat one moment, a warning shot, and a full closure declaration the very next. Even the United Nations has stepped directly into this, with the Secretary General issuing an unusually direct and urgent statement warning that a return to full-scale hostilities would have catastrophic consequences, not just for the peoples of the region, but for international peace and security, and for the global economy as a whole. He specifically called on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, avoid further escalation, and immediately take steps to de-escalate this exact situation. When the United Nations feels compelled to issue that kind of direct, urgent warning about a regional conflict, it tells you the stakes here extend far beyond just two countries fighting over a shipping lane. This genuinely has the potential to destabilize energy markets and economic stability on a truly global scale if it continues spiraling in the direction it's currently headed. So let's bring this back to the number that started this entire story, that 3.6% jump in Brent crude, climbing to $78.70 a barrel. On its own, that might sound like a modest, almost boring market movement. But context is everything here, because this jump happened within hours of this latest round of strikes and retaliation. It happened as vessel traffic through one of the world's most critical oil corridors collapsed to its lowest level in 5 weeks. And it happened while a formal, internationally brokered ceasefire that was supposed to guarantee stability for 60 full days effectively fell apart in less than a week. Prices are still well below the wartime peaks this same conflict produced earlier this year, when Brent crude soared above $120 a barrel. But the direction of travel right now is unmistakable. And if this escalation continues at anything close to its current pace, that gap between today's prices and this year's earlier peak could close a lot faster than most people expect. What happens next depends on a genuinely uncertain set of variables. Will Oman's proposed compromise over the Strait's shipping lanes actually hold long enough to get both sides back to the negotiating table? Or will it collapse the same way this week's ceasefire just did? Will Trump's political urgency to lower oil prices before the midterms translate into renewed diplomatic pressure? Or will continued Iranian attacks on American allied nations force an even more aggressive military response instead? And will the rest of the world, already dealing with disrupted shipping, stranded flights, and now a helium shortage threatening the chip industry, start absorbing economic pain severe enough to force outside powers to intervene more directly in pushing both sides back toward the table? None of these questions have clear answers yet. But what we do know, based on everything we've just walked through, is that the 60-day window the world was promised for peace has effectively been shattered. And the global economy is already starting to feel the consequences in real time. One barrel of oil, one damaged vessel, and one collapsed diplomatic proposal at a time. So here's what I want to know from you watching this right now. Do you think this conflict gets contained and pulled back from the brink before it spirals into something far worse? Or do you think we are watching the early stages of a much wider, much more dangerous war across the entire Gulf region? Drop your take in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of every strike, every market reaction, and every diplomatic twist in this conflict as it unfolds, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next update.